Welcome back to the deep dive, everybody. We're diving into a topic today that I know hits close to home for many of our listeners, especially those of you who, like us, hold the Catholic faith close to your hearts.
Absolutely. And the concern we're addressing, really a question that weighs heavily on many, is how Europe, once a bastion of Christianity, a place where faith seemed so deeply rooted, now finds itself grappling with the reality of largely empty churches.
Yeah, it's a stark contrast, thinking about how just a few generations ago, religious practice was so widespread in places like France, Italy, Spain, even Ireland. And now, well, the picture's quite different.
It's a transformation, a decline that's unfolded really rapidly, and it's left many wondering,
Yeah.
how did this happen so quickly? What factors led to such a profound shift in such a relatively short span of time?
Exactly, and that's what we're going to explore in this deep dive. We've been looking at this issue, this rapid secularization of Europe, through a traditional Catholic lens, pulling in a variety of sources.
We've got some insightful historical analyses, looking back at the trajectory of religious practice over time, some theological arguments that grapple with potential internal shifts within the church, and even some social commentary that reflects on those broader cultural changes that have been sweeping through Europe for decades now.
Right, and we're even touching on some more sensitive topics, the idea of potential influences that might have had an impact on the church from within.
It's important to emphasize here, our goal isn't to point fingers or lay blame. This isn't about judgment. It's about understanding.
Yeah, it's about getting to the heart of what traditional Catholic thought offers as potential explanations for this dramatic emptying of the pews, as they say.
So let's start by grounding ourselves in just how significant this decline has been. I mean, the numbers paint a pretty stark picture.
Yeah, they do.
Think about France for a second. Back in the 1950s, about 25% of Catholics regularly attended Sunday Mass. Today, that number has plummeted to, get this, under 2%.
Wow. That's a staggering drop.
It is, and it highlights that this isn't some gradual fading away of faith. It's a seismic shift.
Right, and we see similar trends in other traditionally Catholic countries, too. Take Germany, for instance.
Yeah, Germany's interesting. They've still got over 20 million registered Catholics on the books, but when you look at actual Mass attendance, well, it's a different story. Only about 6% attend regularly.
Yeah, and these numbers really make you stop and think, what on earth happened to account for such a dramatic departure from what was once the norm?
It's a question that demands careful consideration, and to do that, I think it helps to look back just for a moment at what things were like a few decades ago.
That's a good point. It's like our sources remind us that in France in the early 1960s, Catholic identity was essentially universal. I mean, infant baptism rates reached an astounding 94%.
That's nearly everyone.
Practically, yeah. So, faith back then wasn't just something people did on Sundays. It was woven into the very fabric of their lives.
It was part of the air they breathed. And that's what makes this decline all the more remarkable. We're talking about societies where Catholic culture and tradition had been dominant for centuries, deeply ingrained.
And then, seemingly out of nowhere, this dramatic unraveling begins. I mean, our sources highlight historian Guillaume Couchet's work, where he pinpoints around 1965 as a kind of turning point.
Yeah, he refers to it as the start of a collapse of Catholic practice in Europe. It's fascinating, really. A very specific point in time where things seem to take a sharp turn.
So we're left with this crucial question. What drove this decline? Was it primarily a matter of those external secular forces finally overwhelming the church?
Or, and this is where things get interesting from a traditional Catholic viewpoint, were there internal changes, within the church itself that perhaps created a sort of vulnerability?
That made it, I guess, less resistant to those outside pressures.
Precisely. So to understand that perspective, let's delve into some of those theological factors that traditional Catholics often point to.
Okay, let's do that. And I think one of the big ones here is this idea of a crisis that emerged, not from external attacks, but from within the church itself.
Right. And at the heart of that is the concept of modernism.
Modernism. And I know this is a complex topic with a lot of nuances.
It is, but put simply, from the traditionalist perspective, modernism represents this sort of subtle intellectual and theological current that sought to, subtly alter core doctrines.
So not a direct assault, but more like, a slow erosion from within.
Exactly. Like water seeping into the cracks of a foundation, gradually weakening it over time.
Right. And our sources frequently point back to St. Pius X, Back in 1907, he condemned modernism as, and I'm quoting here, the synthesis of all heresies. That's pretty strong language.
It is, and his warnings about it, wow, they really resonate with traditional Catholics today.
Like he talked about these partisans of error who would be, get this, hidden within the church itself.
And their goal, as he saw it, would be to gradually transform the collective conscience. Really unsettling idea.
Yeah, this image of a kind of internal subversion working to undermine the faith from within.
And the ultimate fear, as Pius X articulated it, was the potential for the annihilation of all religion through this slow corruption of doctrine.
Wow. And when you look at the state of religious practice in Europe today, I mean, it's not hard to see why those warnings from over a century ago carry so much weight for traditional Catholics.
Absolutely. Then, of course, we have to talk about this Second Vatican Council.
Vatican II, a huge moment in church history, held from 1962 to 1965.
A period of immense change and renewal.
Right, and our sources acknowledge that it was convened with good intentions, with the aim of, engaging the modern world and revitalizing the church.
But, and this is where traditionalist concerns come in, they often argue that the period following the council saw a kind of influx of what they consider to be these modernist ideas.
So it's not that they necessarily reject the council itself.
No, not outright.
Right.
But it's the interpretation and implementation of its documents that they often take issue with.
Like, they believe that in the years after Vatican II, there was a kind of loosening of, doctrinal clarity, a move away from some of those traditional teachings and practices that they hold dear.
Right, and Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre, a pivotal figure in the development of traditionalist thought, he argued that this new spirit that emerged post-Vatican II led to, well, a lot of questioning of established doctrine.
Like suddenly those things that were once considered settled were up for debate.
Exactly, and he saw that as incredibly damaging, leading to confusion among the faithful.
And he didn't just see this as an intellectual exercise, right?
No, he drew a direct line between this theological shift and what he perceived as a decline in religious practice. A laxity in morals and a loss of reverence for the sacraments.
Yeah, and he pointed to those sharp drops we saw in the years immediately after Vatican II, from 1965 to 1975. Vocations to the priesthood and religious life plummeted, mass attendance tanked, fewer baptisms, fewer marriages in the church. It's a compelling argument, even if it's one that not everyone agrees with.
And it's important to note here that even Pope Paul VI himself, back in 1972, expressed a deep concern about what he called the entry of the smoke of Satan into the temple of God.
Wow, and for traditional Catholics, that wasn't just some figure of speech.
No, they saw it as a confirmation from the highest authority in the church that something was amiss. Something potentially even diabolical was at work.
So we've got this internal dimension, this theological shift that traditionalists see as a key factor in the decline. But we also have to acknowledge the massive social and cultural transformations that were happening in Europe during this same period.
Absolutely. Post-World War II, Europe was a period of unprecedented change. The economic landscape was rapidly transforming, welfare states were expanding, and secular liberal values were gaining widespread acceptance. These were huge shifts in how society functioned and what people valued.
And as our sources point out, sociological studies have often observed a correlation between increased material wealth and a decline in religious practice.
It's like as societies become more prosperous, more individualistic, that sense of reliance on communal structures like the church, well, it tends to diminish.
Right, and I think Pope Pius XII's warnings about the potential loss of the sense of sin become really relevant here.
Absolutely, because the 1960s saw this rapid shift in societal norms, and behaviors that were once considered, contrary to Catholic teaching were suddenly becoming normalized, even celebrated.
The sexual revolution was in full swing. Contraception and abortion were becoming legal in many countries. And the media, well, it was increasingly secular, often promoting messages that directly contradicted traditional Christian morality.
And it's in this context that Pope Paul VI issued his encyclical Humanae Vitae in 1968, which reaffirmed the Church's traditional teaching against artificial contraception.
And that didn't go over so well with a lot of people, did it?
No, it didn't. Humanae Vitae became a flashpoint, a symbol of this growing divide between church teaching and the lived experience of many Catholics.
And it wasn't just lay people who disagreed with it.
Right, you saw significant dissent from within the clergy and theological circles, too.
Which is really significant because it suggests that this wasn't just a matter of the church being out of touch with modern society. It was a sign of a real internal struggle, a questioning of authority and tradition.
And Humanae Vitae arguably contributed to this phenomenon of what some call cafeteria Catholicism.
Where people pick and choose which teachings they agree with, kind of creating their own personalized version of the faith.
Exactly. And that erosion of a unified understanding and acceptance of church doctrine, well, it certainly played a role in the broader decline of religious practice.
And this concern about a crisis of faith was echoed by later popes, too. Benedict XVI spoke about it quite a bit.
He did. And John Paul II, he even used the term silent apostasy to describe this phenomena where people might still identify as Catholic, but their lives don't reflect it at all. It's like they're living as if God doesn't exist.
And from a traditional Catholic perspective, this disconnect between faith and life, well, it's often seen as a consequence of giving in to those temptations that have always been there. Worldly pride, sensuality, the desire for immediate gratification over eternal concerns.
It's that age-old struggle between the spirit and the flesh.
And we also can't ignore the increasing marginalization of the church in public life, can we?
No, we can't. The rise of secularization ideologies like laïcité in France, that strict separation of church and state, has had a profound impact.
It's like religion has been pushed further and further into the private sphere, its influence in society diminishing with each passing decade.
And of course, tragically, we have to mention the clergy sexual abuse scandals.
Yeah, those have inflicted immeasurable damage on the church's moral authority, and they've undoubtedly led many people to question their faith or even walk away entirely.
It's been a devastating blow, and it's hard to overstate the harm that's been done.
But, and this is interesting, traditional Catholics often point to a counterexample that they find quite telling.
Oh, you mean how those regions and communities that have maintained a strong connection to traditional devotional practices, the older liturgy, they seem to have weathered these storms a bit better.
Exactly, like Poland, for instance, or those communities attached to the traditional Latin Mass. They've shown greater resilience in the face of secularization.
And that suggests that maybe those external pressures alone aren't the whole story. It hints at the possibility that something internal, a change in emphasis within the church, might have made it more susceptible to those secular forces.
So this brings us to a more delicate area of discussion.
You mean those explanations that go beyond the purely social, cultural, or historical? Those that delve into the realm of the natural and even the supernatural?
Exactly. And I know this is where things can get a bit controversial.
They can. But it's a perspective that we need to acknowledge because it's one that many traditional Catholics hold.
And they're not just, dismissing those other factors we've discussed.
No, they recognize the very real impact of social change, the influence of secularism, the harm caused by the scandals.
But they also consider the possibility that something more, something perhaps spiritual, is at play.
And that could be, as some suggest, a form of spiritual chastisement, a consequence of turning away from God and his laws.
Or even, and this is where things get even more sensitive, some degree of diabolic influence.
Now, I know that might sound, I don't know, a bit extreme to some.
It can, but it's rooted in a deeply held worldview, one that takes seriously the reality of spiritual warfare.
Right. And the warnings and prophecies of Senior Lucia Fatima are often referenced here.
Yeah, like her warnings about a diabolical disorientation that would affect many, the spread of false doctrines that would lead people astray.
And what's fascinating is this idea that even well-intentioned people within the church could be affected, that this disorientation wouldn't just target those outside the faith.
It's like a kind of spiritual fog that descends, clouding judgment and making it hard to discern truth from falsehood.
Exactly, and Senior Lucia consistently emphasized the power of prayer, especially the rosary, as a weapon against this spiritual confusion.
And then there's this theological concept of divine chastisement.
The idea that when nations or societies turn away from God, they might experience trials and tribulations as a form of correction.
Like a loving father disciplining his children. It's a tough concept to grapple with, but it's one that has a long history in both the Old and New Testaments.
And from this perspective, the rapid secularization of Europe could be seen as a consequence of a collective turning away from God, a spiritual reaping of what's been sown.
And the prophecies attributed to Our Lady of Akita, they also play a role in this line of thinking, don't they?
They do, especially her warnings about God's anger, the potential for a terrible punishment for humanity if it doesn't repent.
And she also spoke about a crisis within the church itself, cardinals against cardinals, bishops against bishops.
And when you look at the current state of affairs, the doctrinal disagreements, the priests leaving their vocations, it's easy to see why those prophecies resonate with traditional Catholics.
It's like they see those prophetic warnings being fulfilled before their very eyes.
And that brings us to what is perhaps the most controversial and sensitive aspect of this whole discussion: the theory of infiltration within the church.
It's a topic that we need to approach with a lot of care and nuance.
Absolutely. And it's important to state up front that not every traditional Catholic subscribes to this view.
Right, and even among those who do, there's a range of beliefs about who might be involved and what their goals might be.
But the core idea here is that the church, as a powerful institution, has been deliberately targeted by those who seek to undermine it from within.
Not through direct attacks, but through a more subtle, long-term strategy of influence.
And our sources point out that this idea, this fear of infiltration, isn't just some recent fringe theory. It has a long history within certain Catholic circles.
Like the historical document known as the Alta Vendita Instructions from the 19th century is often brought up in this context.
That document, attributed to a secret society, supposedly outlined a plan to subtly infiltrate the church and steer it away from its traditional teachings.
Now, the authenticity and impact of that document are debated, but it reflects this long-standing anxiety about the potential for internal subversion. And then there's the testimony of Bella Dodd, a former high-ranking member of the American Communist Party who later converted to Catholicism.
Her story is fascinating. She claimed that the Communist Party had a deliberate strategy to encourage its members to infiltrate seminaries and religious orders.
Wow, with the aim of what? Influencing the church from within.
Exactly. Kind of like a long-term game of ideological chess. Plant your people in positions of influence and gradually shift the direction of the institution.
Now, again, it's hard to definitively prove or disprove claims like that, but they do raise some unsettling questions.
They do, especially when you consider the broader context of the Cold War and the various ways in which religion was targeted by hostile powers.
Right, and then we have the accounts of Ion Mihai Pacepa, the former head of Romanian foreign intelligence.
He defected to the West and revealed a lot about the KGB's activities, including their efforts to create and support radical theological movements like liberation theology in Latin America.
So again, it's clear that intelligence agencies were actively involved in trying to manipulate religious groups for their own purposes.
And that, for some, lends a certain plausibility to the idea that similar, perhaps less overt, efforts could have been directed at the Catholic Church.
So it's important to reiterate that not every traditional Catholic subscribes to every claim of infiltration. Discernment is always urged.
But the underlying concern, the worry that the church might have been targeted from within, well, it's a persistent one.
And it ties into some of those biblical warnings about false prophets, wolves in sheep's clothing.
Right, and even papal statements throughout history have warned about the potential for enemies within the church.
It's a sobering thought, and it leads some to wonder if that auto-demolition of the church that Pope Paul VI spoke about might be, in part, the result of this kind of infiltration, combined with human weakness and those external pressures we talked about earlier. So as we wrap up this deep dive, we've covered a lot of ground. We've looked at the internal theological shifts that traditional Catholics often see as a key factor in Europe's secularization.
We've explored the massive impact of those social and cultural changes, the rise of secularism, the decline of traditional morality, the devastating effect of the scandals.
We've even delved into those more controversial explanations, the ideas of spiritual chastisement, diabolic influence, and infiltration within the church.
And it's important to remember, this is all seen through the lens of traditional Catholic thought, a particular way of understanding the world and the place of faith within it.
Right, and it's a perspective that views the current state of affairs in Europe with a deep sense of concern.
A sense of loss, even.
Yeah, a sense that something precious has been lost, and that a return to traditional principles, to those unchanging truths of the faith, is essential for renewal.
And within that traditional understanding, there's a strong emphasis on the importance of sound doctrine, reverent worship, a return to those practices that foster a deeper connection with God.
Like the traditional Latin Mass, for instance, which has seen a resurgence in recent years.
Right, and there's also a strong focus on the power of prayer, penance, a more rigorous spiritual life.
It's a call to go deeper, to live out the faith more fully in the face of these challenges.
And amidst all this, there is hope too. Pope Benedict VI's vision of a smaller but more fervent church, a creative minority that might one day lead a re-evangelization that resonates with many.
It's that idea that even in the midst of decline, the faithful remnant will endure.
And ultimately, traditional Catholics find hope in those promises of Christ. The gates of hell shall not prevail against it.
And in the words of Our Lady of Fatima, in the end, my immaculate heart will triumph.
So, as we conclude, we leave you with this final thought. How might these insights, this traditional Catholic understanding of Europe's secularization, how might it inform your own understanding of the faith?
Does it challenge you? Does it inspire you? Does it lead you to re-examine your own beliefs and practices?
These are big questions, questions that deserve careful consideration. And we hope that this deep dive has, at the very least, given you some food for thought. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.